Hello, today we're going to be going through a quick lesson about philosophy within Lincoln-Douglas debate. Lincoln-Douglas debate is known as the debate of morals in both the high school and the college forms of debate. And that's because as opposed to other debates, we don't inherently go with this one type of philosophy because most of the time debates are generally focused on the consequences of affirming or negating the resolution, which of course is an option within LD as we will get to discuss. But there are other ways that we can view the debate, and the way in which we look at the debate is going to completely shape what arguments are able to be ran against any specific topic. So it's important to be able to understand these different philosophies. And of course, it's impossible to know all of them and every single value or value criterion that could possibly be run against you, simply because there are so many of them. But it is important to know the basic ideas of the most common ones, A, because these are obviously the ones you're going to see most often, and B, simply having a more philosophical mindset going into the debate and understanding how philosophy generally works will help you understand your opponent's value and criterion based simply off the short definitions they give and any questions you manage to ask during cross-examination. So let's just get right into the actual philosophy. So this is something that most of you have probably heard of, but we're going to talk about the trolley problem. So the trolley problem is this thought experiment that has been provided where you are sitting next to a switch for a trolley that'll change the track that it is traveling on. The track it is currently heading towards has 5 people tied to it, and they will all die if the trolley goes down that path. But if you flip the switch, it'll change paths to a rail that only has 1 person tied to it, and that 1 person will die. Now, naturally, most people choose to flip the switch and send it down the path with only the 1 person. Generally, this thought experiment is a lot more fun to just have you guys discuss, but unfortunately, we really don't have that ability with these virtual lessons. So most people are going to choose to change the path to save the most lives. Obviously, it's bad that we have to have that 1 person die, but the fact that you're able to save 4 lives is enough to convince most people to flip the switch. However, there are some people who would choose not to do it because they feel like the life of the 1 person is on their hands if they flip the switch, whereas simply letting fate run its course and go down the path with the 5 people makes them not morally responsible. Now, personally, I don't agree with that philosophy, and I believe that you should actively try and do what's going to produce the best consequences for society, which we'll discuss what that actually means within a broad sense. But obviously, no answer here is inherently right. Even if the vast majority of society would go with flipping the switch and setting it down the new path, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the right answer, because there is no right answer to philosophy. What 1 person views as morally correct is going to differ from person to person, and we should respect that. But also, within debate, we should argue about which side is, of course, right whenever people have differing interpretations. But before we move on and address those interpretations, there are a couple of things that we can change about the trolley problem to maybe make you think about it a little differently. So we also have the ability to argue about what type of people are tied up on these tracks. So let's say we have the exact same situation where we can flip the switch, instead of killing 5 people, only kill 1, but the 5 people are prisoners and the 1 person is an innocent person. Now, personally, I would argue that we should still flip the switch, simply because A, obviously it is killing less people, and B, because all lives are inherently equal no matter what those people have done with their lives. However, of course, this is once again something that then makes it a little bit more controversial to people. Whenever we have this, less people are willing to flip the switch because they believe that the life of 1 good person has more weight to it than even 5 lives of supposedly quote-unquote bad people. So, of course, this is just another thing to show that people have a lot of inherently different values to them. So even if we value consequences as the best thing, how we actually weigh those consequences are going to be different. Whereas I think all lives are equal and that we should value them equally, some people believe that some people deserve to live more than others. And, of course, once again, those things aren't inherently wrong. That's just a viewpoint that different people have. Another one that I really like to think about is a very similar situation. A trolley is traveling down a path and is going to hit 5 people who are tied to the rail, and they are all going to die. However, this time you are not next to a switch that can change the path. There is only one rail. But you are on a bridge next to a very large man, and you have the option to push him over the bridge onto the rail. He will stop the trolley, and only he will die. The question is, of course, do you push the man? Funnily enough, most of the time whenever I ask my novice this question, they always become very hyper-fixated on the fact that he is a fatter man, and they believe that that kind of like justifies it, and they think that it's like, oh, well, he's more likely to die soon anyway. Which is definitely interesting thinking. As I already stated, I definitely would not opt down the path for that reason. But the reason why I really like this one is because even barring that, most people are going to be less likely to push the man, even though it has the same consequences as flipping the switch. Once we actually break it down, the difference is between one person dying or you getting involved, 5 people dying, or you getting involved and only one person dying. So it raises questions about why we have this differing interpretation among these two different situations that are largely the same. And the reasoning behind this is, of course, pushing a man is much more personal than simply flipping a switch. You feel a lot more directly responsible from pushing a man over a bridge and directly causing his death than simply flipping a switch and, oh, it just happens to have this effect. Obviously you're aware of what you're doing, but the actual act of pushing him is very different to the more indirect act of the switch. Which then just goes to show oftentimes that our morals are somewhat bendable. I don't want to say bendable, but they differ based off the specifics of a situation, and trying to boil down a person to one specific philosophy oftentimes is faulty due to the fact that we are complex human beings that don't necessarily have one answer to every single problem. Next, let's move on to some basic information about the two different types that philosophy overall. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of different specific philosophical ideas, but most of them can fall under these two categories. And of course, we've already started to address them a little bit. The main one that people generally tend to identify with is consequentialism, which is what I personally believe in, as you can, I'm sure, can tell based off what I was just saying. But the basic idea behind this, surprise, surprise, is that we are going to value producing good consequences. You've probably heard the phrase that the ends justify the means. And if you don't know what that means, it's saying that if you produce good consequences, that's what's important. It doesn't matter what you have to do to get there. If you have to do a horrible action to save the lives of many, then some people would argue, specifically consequentialists, that the ends justify the means, and you should do that action because overall you're still producing the best benefits for society. Obviously, this one is going to be very easy to measure, because although people are going to have different ideas about which consequences specifically are more good than others, if we have tangible things such as saving people's lives, that's a lot easier to say this is something that we are doing for sure. It's very measurable. Beyond that, the basic word that you can, or phrase that you can use to boil down consequentialism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. As long as you are producing that, most consequentialist theories would argue that you are doing the right action. We'll get in a bit more in depth on these as we obviously explore specific types of philosophies, but this one is by far easier to understand than the other one, deontology. So let's address that one really quick. On the flip side here, deontologists argue that your intent is actually what matters behind your action. It's not the actual consequences that are produced, but it is your action itself and whether or not that action is morally right, and then what you are hoping to do with that action. So, for instance, a example I always like to bring up is lying. Now, some people might argue that lying is okay because it can sometimes produce good consequences for everyone. For instance, you don't want to tell someone that you hate what they're wearing because that would obviously like hurt their feelings, and it doesn't produce like good consequences for society. But a deontologist would argue that if they ask you, you should give them the truth because lying itself is inherently wrong. It's a bad act, and even if it produces good consequences, that does not make it okay to do. Deontology can definitely get a lot deeper than this and a lot more complex depending on what specific theory that you're talking about. And we're going to discuss one specific theory that is generally, it can be used in debate a lot and is pretty dense, but it's definitely not as bad as deontology can get as well. So this one is definitely used a lot less within debate, deontology as a whole as compared to consequentialism. But if you understand these two big ideas, you can categorize almost any type of philosophy. There's also this one called virtue ethics, which is, to my understanding, I haven't studied this one quite as much. It's about like specific values and virtues that are important and inherent to you and that you should be pushing. But it's never really used in debate. In my 3.5 years of debating, I've never seen it run nor really talked about. The only time I've ever heard it talked about was when I was discussing philosophy with a philosophy major who had done LD, and he had also said that it wasn't worth talking about. So I would definitely not worry about that. But these are the two big ideas. So let's go philosophy by philosophy and actually address things that you might see in an LD round. Because most of the time, you're not going to see people say that my value is consequentialism or deontology. This is just a basic way to understand them. So the first one, and by far the most common value criterion that you will see in Lincoln Douglas debate, is utilitarianism. This is the most prevalent form of consequentialism and also the most pure form. As we've already talked about, it's the greatest good. This is what we were saying under consequentialism and how we want to be producing these good consequences for the greatest number of people. Specifically, it's this idea of avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, because obviously what is good is going to be somewhat subjective, as is pain and pleasure, obviously. But that is like the general concept that we'll use. And obviously within the scope of the debate, most of the time things that we argue as good are going to be something that we can view as good for all people. This isn't 100% true, obviously, as there's dissenters to every issue, but you're not going to have to argue about the semantics of what's good if you're saying that you're saving people's lives. Like if anyone ever tried to, in an LD round, say that you're doing bad things because you're saving people's lives, they're going to lose that round. So most of the consequences that we'll talk about in debate are either good or bad, and it's very black and white like that. There's two specific types of utilitarianism. The most common one is ACT, but there's also this idea of rule utilitarianism. And the two ideas in like differing theories behind this is that ACT focuses on the specific action that we're taking, and then if that is going to be producing good consequences. This one is a lot better used in debate because we're talking about a specific plan. So, for instance, on the current topic, which is the United States ought to provide a federal jobs guarantee, that is the specific act that we are doing, and we should analyze whether or not the United States giving a federal jobs guarantee right now is going to produce good consequences. However, we also have rule utilitarianism, which is a bit more general, and it's a like weird mix between deontology and consequentialism, oddly enough, because it argues that we should look at consequences, but not for this specific action. We should look at how that action would generally change society. So, for instance, looking at the federal jobs guarantee, a way that we could make it a more ruled utilitarianism framework is by arguing that a federal jobs guarantee generally produces good consequences. I can't necessarily prove that's going to do it in this situation in the United States, but I can say that generally for society, having a federal jobs guarantee is good, therefore we should do it. Rule is not used very much in debate or just philosophy in general, to my understanding. ACT is by far the more common one, and as I've stated, it's also the one that is like very specific to debate and just fits the format more. But it's still just good to know what rule utilitarianism is, and also I love philosophy, and I think it's great to learn a bit more about it. The next overall concept that we're going to talk about is justice. Most of the time when you hear about justice, obviously, the place where your brain automatically goes is like the criminal justice system and trying to punish criminals. But oftentimes that doesn't actually line up with what justice is. Obviously, the goal of the criminal justice system is to give justice, but there are definitely faults within that system. In fact, my freshman year, we had a topic which was about changing the criminal justice system, specifically by getting rid of the plea bargaining process. And the affirmative side argued that by having plea bargaining, the criminal justice system was in fact failing on delivering justice. So it's important not to become too ingrained in this idea that justice is based off this one specific institution in society, because that's not at all what the idea actually comes from. It's actually that the criminal justice system is made to serve this concept. So to better understand that concept as it is removed from the criminal justice system, we can see that it's giving people what they are due, which obviously what someone is due is very vague, which is why there's a lot of different definitions of how we're going to achieve justice. Naturally, your value, which is what justice is almost always going to be, needs to be a little vague anyway. Frequently in rounds, I have opponents attack me and say that my value is too vague, which is really what the point is, because the value criterion is made to help us understand how to actually achieve that somewhat vague value. It gives us specific steps that we need to take in order to do things such as maximizing justice. But of course, it's still important to be somewhat specific with what you're arguing. We also have this little aside here that justice can be more specified as fulfilling one's purpose and giving one the tools in order to do that. This is Plato's, as it says right there, interpretation of justice, which is somewhat interesting, but also somewhat outdated for our current society. And that general definition is one that isn't overly common within debate. Now, my personal favorite definition of justice, and one that is very useful in debate, is this idea of justice as fairness, which comes from a really famous philosopher, John Rawls. And if you at all plan on using this philosophy in a debate round, you should definitely go read some of his work, or even simplifications of his work, because he is really the father of this theory. And this one is very simple. It's exactly what it sounds like, but it's saying that justice is given by producing fair situations for all people. It's really not all that more complicated than that. Obviously, people kind of get into these thoughts that philosophy can be highly complicated and not for the layman. But justice specifically is one that can be somewhat easy to grasp, and it's just making sure that people have the same opportunities. As we can see down there, it also says that it's about what people are actually getting and making sure that it is not equal but proportional. And that's important here because I believe we'll talk about it later in this slideshow, but there's a difference between equality and equity, because equality is giving everyone the same thing, but equity is giving people what they need. A welfare state would be an example of equity, because we don't give everyone the same amount of money for being in society. We only give it to people through welfare who really need it. So this is that same idea. It's giving people what they are due and what they need in order to succeed, assuming that is, your definition. As we've already stated, this one is a bit more malleable, and depending on what your value criterion is, you can really change the meaning of it. But justice is definitely a good one to use. For a year and a half, it was the only value I used because I love justice so much, and it's great. Another one, this one is rather simple, but it's this idea of autonomy. And it's simply saying that we should give people the ability to make their own choices. We shouldn't force our will upon other people. So, for instance, I'm trying to think of a really good topic where we could use autonomy, but we haven't really actually the September-October topic for 2020 was about compulsory voting, and we should make people go and vote. And obviously a lot of people would say things such as this can reduce barriers to voting and it's just good for democracy, but many people on the negative side said that it's taking away people's abilities to make choices for themselves. By forcing them to come in and vote, you are taking away their autonomy. This is obviously a more deontological value, because even if the consequences of taking away people's autonomy is good, we're saying that we shouldn't do that because that's just something that is inherently wrong. It's this idea of not treating people as a means to an end, which is an important term to remember because it's one that we'll actually come back to later whenever we get to one of the most important deontological theories in philosophy and Lincoln Douglas debate. The next one is going to be egalitarianism, and we're going to blast through this one really quick because this is by far one of the most simple ones. Egalitarianism is simply a fancy word for equality. It's we should give everyone the same thing. We already talked about the difference between equality and equity a little bit, and you could make an argument for egalitarianism being equity, but really it's unnecessary, and this value isn't used super often. I haven't seen it used this year at all, but I have seen it used in the past, and it generally is going with this like arguments that we should minimize oppression among all people, which is why this isn't a good value, because although those are great arguments, they're better paired, in my opinion, with justice, because it's more about giving people who are being harmed, i.e. oppressed groups such as racial minorities and generally like women and LGBTQ people, like giving them better rights and reducing their oppression. It's not actually about equality itself. So that's why I would definitely prefer justice. But this is, once again, something that you will probably see at some point in your career, and it's important to know what they're talking about, because some people like to try and trip you up with big words like egalitarianism and think that it can make it to where you won't understand what's going on in the round. And those people are the worst. But unfortunately, debate is sometimes filled with some not great people who try and do really like skeezy arguments. But so that's egalitarianism. Another relatively simple one is governmental legitimacy, which this idea is that the government has the power over the people, but the people need to understand and approve of that government before they have any ability to rule over the people. Obviously, a lot of what's going to come down to governmental legitimacy is removing things like corruption and promoting values like democracy. People view a government as legitimate and will agree with their decisions generally, even if they didn't like necessarily vote them in, if they trust in the democratic process. In America, this is actually something that is not as common because people generally on both sides of the political spectrum have like a distrust in the government, because we're definitely a society based more off of like the two-party system that is, instead of building up our own party, it's hating the other. But in other places in the world, although that is still somewhat common, they are more built on this idea of governmental legitimacy, because people actually will agree with what the government does and be not necessarily happy, but approving of it, because they understand that democracy is what led to this cause. They might not agree with the impact of an election, but they understand that the people decided to vote that way, and that's how the election is going to play out. Which, of course, in America right now is a very topical discussion matter that we won't get into, but it's definitely a good value in debate, because we're saying that if we have ways to reduce corruption or promote democracy, that's going to help increase governmental legitimacy. This is one that I really enjoyed in my younger years, like as a freshman and a little bit as a sophomore, and I became a little bit more disenfranchised with it over time, and I didn't think it was as good as I had originally thought. I definitely think there are some specific topics that are really good for this. So, for instance, my sophomore year, we had one about if, like, public officials for office should, like, have a right to privacy. It was a lot more complex than that, but I don't remember the exact wording anymore. So, obviously, that's a really good one for governmental legitimacy, because you can say that by being more open with their like private lives, people will trust more in the government. But generally, it's only in those hyper specific situations that it's going to be useful, and you're not going to be able to apply this one to most topics. Like for the lethal autonomous weapons topic that is coming up in January and February, you could probably spin one talking about how like war is bad and it reduces governmental legitimacy, but like overall, this would be not a great value criterion to use. So be careful with this one. All right. This is another one that I like a lot, but I don't know how like applicable it can be to debate. This is just it definitely is used sometimes, but I personally don't think I've ever used it. But also it's just a really fun philosophy. So the social contract is this idea that there is agreements that when we enter society about what the role of the government is and what we as the people should give to the government in return. There's two main competing theories when it comes to social contract, and it comes down to these two philosophers, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Now, John Locke argued that there are these natural rights that people are entitled to, such as life, liberty, and property. Obviously, two of those should sound very familiar to you because Thomas Jefferson pulled upon these ideas of John Locke when writing the Declaration of Independence and stated that life, liberty, and then changed it to pursuit of happiness were the most important rights in society. So obviously that's something that's very important to us in the United States. But anyway, he argued that there were these inherent rights that people deserved and that without the government, there's no way to ensure that people have these rights. So we enter society and allow government for the sole purpose of protecting these rights. And beyond that, the government doesn't really have anything that they're entitled to do. I'm sure also John Locke might argue that there's nothing they should do and that that's all they should protect. And then beyond that, the government should not interact with society at all. But we're going to then give up some of our rights to make sure that the government has the ability to protect these most basic natural rights, which I know sounds a little confusing because it's what? You're giving up rights to protect rights, but it's rights to when we use the word rights, it's not what you generally think about where it's oh, my First Amendment right to freedom of speech. Most of the time in that way, we mean it's oh, we pay taxes to the government. So it's oh, obviously that's a lot more reasonable. So looking at a competing interpretation of the social contract, it comes with Thomas Hobbes, who argues that once again, the state of nature and where the world is without government is not good and it's completely chaotic. But people are inherently evil. Keep on using the word inherently a lot. That's a good philosophy word, but that people are evil at their core, and that the government is going to come in to basically stop them from destroying and devouring each other. So this one is another one that is focused on liberty and not having too much government interaction, but saying that we should enter society and give up certain rights to have laws to protect people's livelihoods and just simply their life itself. So these obviously are somewhat similar interpretations of the social contract, and it's the same idea that we give up certain rights and to protect other rights. They just have differing interpretations on why and what actual rights we should have. The next one, this was a really big argument that I was talking about. It's the most important deontological framework that you'll ever see, and it's very complicated. But I'm going to try and break it down as much as possible. But this is one that definitely, if you're interested in philosophy at all, you should go research more on your own. So, the categorical imperative is this philosophy made by this guy, Immanuel Kant, who argued that there are certain actions that are going to be inherently good, as we've already talked about under deontology. And he gave forth 3 formulations for how we are going to decide that. And there's only 2 that really matter. So the first one that we are going to talk about, at least, is the formulation of universality. And this argues that for a action to be morally right, it has to be physically able to be applied in all circumstances, and also it has to be morally right in all circumstances. So what this means is, first, the fact that we literally have to be able to do it. It's something that if everyone was doing, it would still work. So, for instance, an example that people use a lot is lying. So let's say I ask someone for money, and I'm like, hey, I'll pay you back if you give me $20. I'll get it back to you. I'm good for it. And I have no intentions of paying this guy back. Simply do not want to do it. I'm just going to take the money, and then I'm $20 richer. And so, he may or he may not give me the money. It's whatever. I can take my shot at it. And then obviously there will be consequences for that action. But if we look at this under a idea of universality, if everyone was always asking for money with no intention of giving it back, then no one's ever going to lend you money, right? They're simply going to be no, I know you're not going to pay me back, and then you're not going to get the money from them. So that's an example of where if we made that action universal, it literally would not be possible anymore. But beyond that, we also have this argument that it has to be applicable in all situations to where it's also morally right. So this is another one where lying is a good example. You could argue that in some situations, lying is the right thing to do, but Kant would argue that if lying is wrong in even one situation, if even telling one type of lie is bad because lying is bad, then lying in every situation is bad. Which obviously is a very high precedent to set for what is morally right. Because most actions, if you really think hard about it enough, you could find a situation where it's like, well, doing that action would be morally wrong. Which is why this theory is like kind of like wishy-washy. So that's the first formulation. It's very like, I try to break it down as much as possible, but this is, as I've already stated, very like dense philosophy. So, if that's still a little confusing, take some time to chew on it and maybe go research. Literally, you can just read the Wikipedia article on the categorical imperative, and it'll still probably be confusing, but with some work, you can figure it out. So, but moving on to the second formulation, which is one that is a lot more simple. It's this idea that you should treat people as an end in their own right. And what that means essentially is don't use people as tools. So don't think of someone as something that you can use to get something that you want. You should instead recognize that they are their own person who has their own wants and dreams. And you should respect those wants and dreams and then try and not use them to achieve your own. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you can't have people help you get something that you want. But you should recognize what they want and try to not go against that idea. This one is just one that kind of comes down to basic human respect, right? It's don't treat people as your own tool to use. That's the key word there is using people as tools. So that's definitely the more simple formulation of the categorical imperative. It's a lot easier and less dense to understand than the other one. There's a third formulation that is essentially combining these two, but it's not really important both within a debate standpoint or even a simple philosophy standpoint. So it's not super important to research it yourself.